Hi, good to see you. The wife cared for her ailing husband for a long time, but she became confused when she overheard him talking to their neighbor one day. With regular care, Lucia rearranged Ricardo's blankets around him, asking, "Are you comfortable like this?" Alternately, "What you require is perhaps," she saw him as he gently found a seat on the sofa, his affliction having considerably restricted his mobility due to multiple sclerosis. His need on crutches has grown. While Ricardo was getting settled in, Lucia hurriedly shifted his gaze to the window and said, "No, everything is perfect. Thank you. I don't know what I would do without you." Ricardo's reaction was a feeble smile and an insincere tone in his voice. After receiving a recommendation from the remote doctor that Ricardo had hired, Lucia made her way to the kitchen to whip up something healthy. Being his wife and a nurse meant that she was also responsible for a lot of the. He takes Ricardo home from the hospital every day with the same unwavering commitment that has persisted for years. As he chops vegetables, he thinks about how he grows more reliant on this routine. Each day, adding a bit more weight to his reality mixed with the air was heavy with the perfume of the herbs he was cutting, a blend of defiance and acceptance. Ricardo returned to the couch and attempted to find a more comfortable posture for his fatigued body. He was no longer nimble due to the effects of multiple sclerosis. Movements as simple as his departure as I adjusted the pillow beneath Lucia's head. I couldn't help but think how much she does for me, but her thanks is lacking. Lucia is incredibly self-reliant and relies on me for nearly everything. Even in my head, it sounded more like a robotic recitation of stock phrases than an expression of genuine emotion. With a platter brimming with colorful food, Lucia came back from the kitchen, promising her beloved, "Here you go. Try to eat a little of everything." She set the tray on the movable table standing next to Ricardo. "You must maintain your might." Lucia watched Ricardo's demeanor shift between professional worry and personal care as he reluctantly took the fork and nodded. "Is the time we spent dancing anything that you often reflect on? Do you remember how you used to make me spin around the living room?" Lucia exclaimed all of a sudden, attempting to break up the monotony with a lighter memory. Ricardo put on an active grin, as if those moments had occurred in an other era, almost to an additional life. "Indeed, I do recall," he replied, but the radiance in his eyes failed to conceal the extreme, emotionally distant nature of his feelings. It was a wonderful period. As Lucia sat by his side, clutching his hand, their conversations summed up their days, which included both the essential care he needed and the unforgettable discussions that attempted to fill the void left by his illness. With all they'd been through together, her thoughts were racing between the present and the past. "We'll keep fighting, though, won't we?" Over to herself, Ricardo said more than two. To find the will to continue, he dug deep into his own reserves of resilience. Lucia imagined the paradox of caring deeply for someone whose reactions appeared so distant as she observed Ricardo, his countenance lit up by the gentle light streaming in through the window. She longed for the two-way street of emotional connection and reciprocity that were formerly so vividly conformed to. "Let's go from shore. Lucia, how about we proceed?" While Ricardo's response was mechanical, his comments lacked the gravity of genuine emotion, even though his frequently came across as meaningless. Lucia kept focusing on Ricardo every day, hoping quietly that they still had time together. Knowing that the sickness had changed many things between them, beyond this routine of care and shallow discussions, she still couldn't accept that she had changed everything. The chamber where Ricardo spent his days confined was bathed in a warm golden light as the morning sun delicately seeped through the drapes. Having mobility, a sweet kiss on Ricardo's forehead was placed by Lucia before she left for another long day of work at the hospital. As usual, she got up early to get ready. "Nothing to worry about. I'll be right over. The groceries are in the fridge," and she said, "Knock," her worry evident in her voice. A dramatic change occurred in Ricardo's demeanor the moment the door shut behind Lucia. His face, which had an artificial frailty about it before, was now lit up by a sly radiance and recharged. He checked to see whether anybody else was present. Then, despite his illness, he rose from the couch and strode to a little safe concealed behind an artwork on the wall, entering the combination with mechanical accuracy. A substantial sum of money was contained within, rescued by Lucia in the event of sudden medical expenses or needs. With a sinister grin, Ricardo tallied the bills and stuffed them into his pocket, thinking, this should be enough for today. Emotional surge as she anticipated the events of the day. Along with all of her love and devotion, she had no clue that Ricardo was faking his illness for years, claiming he could walk just well, and squandering the family's money on his own pleasures now that he had the house to himself, all while she was saving lives in the hospital. Without turning around, Ricardo went to a secret area of the city where a hidden nightclub was always bustling with activity, even during the day, as the lights swayed through the ambience. The pleasant scent of exotic cocktails wafted across the room as techno music reverberated off the walls. With the assurance of someone who was familiar with the area, Ricardo made his way into the club. At the bar, he got the priciest drink and savored every sip like a candy. As he watched the throng, he thought, why live a false life if I can't enjoy the fruits it gives me? In response to the restrictions he had imposed at home, these joys were not something Ricardo let himself just to get away from his problems. They served as an incentive to keep up the charade. Even though a lot of time had gone by, Ricardo remained at the party, carefree and laughing and dancing his heart out. Every dime that he spent was a symbol of the power he had over his home life. He enjoyed the independence that his deceit had granted him as Lucia worked tirelessly, and when he got home he reclined on the couch as if nothing had transpired. When Lucia returned, the door swung open and night fell. Finally finished another day of substantial work. Exhausted but content, my love, how was your day? Did you manage? Curiously, she inquired, oblivious to the fact that the blackness that resided nearby dwarfed the nighttime shadows. Ricardo replied to Lucia while continuing to settle on the sofa in an effort to appear weak. He spoke in a low voice, but his barely concealed annoyance came through. It was a long day, love. I felt a lot of pain. I didn't leave here. However, he avoided making eye contact with her, as if he were terrified that she would find out that. Was able to discern her deceit's soft knocks were heard at the door at that very moment. With a sigh of relief, Lucia went to answer it. The old neighbor, Marisol, was there, holding a platter piled high with slices of baked cake. I had some cake with me. On your behalf, she said, how is Ricardo today? In a kind yet sincere tone. Lucia masked her tiredness behind a fake grin. Marisol, I'm grateful. Ricardo, as usual, hasn't done anything to help, but we'll keep battling. Gratefully took the sweet treat. From the living room, Ricardo listened to the talk, wishing Esperanza's remarks were more genuine. When Lucia came back, he questioned who was at the door in a brusque and somewhat nasty manner, but it wasn't due of the type of distractions would be less of a concern for a sick husband than the possibility that his secret might be revealed. According to Lucia, Marisol brought a cake for us and Lucia went to the kitchen to set it on the counter. Sit down and start to wind down the meal instead of saying anything else. Ricardo dove farther under the blankets, his heart racing at the thought that Marisol may have shown up at the worst possible moment on another day. Lucia completed dinner and placed it on the sofa for Ricardo to eat. Years of constant care, with hopes renewed daily but little or no development in sight, left him emotionally and psychologically exhausted, and he retreated to the kitchen, where he sat at the table and sighed heavily. Concern for Ricardo's well-being started to mount in her thoughts, prompted by subtle indications that she had previously disregarded. In response to an abrupt urge, Lucia stood up and collected the prescription for Ricardo's meds. As she read the names of the medications, she pondered why he was not improving. After making a promise to look them up online later, Lucia went to the location where the guard had left the emergency funds in the hopes of purchasing more goods that could be useful. However, when she opened the safe, she discovered that it was empty. She felt a sudden jumble of emotions. She searched the safe once more, hoping she had been mistaken, but the truth was plain to see. "This is strange," she whispered. "All of a sudden, the funds vanished. Honestly, I can't even remember where I put the money. He seems to have vanished, and we have the emergency funds stashed somewhere. Have you seen them?" From the kitchen, Lucia yelled out, her voice betraying a mix of bewilderment and worry. Ricardo's reply was brief, hasty, and evasive. I'm not sure what Lucia meant. Perhaps you utilized it, but failed to remember these. This past week has been absolutely bewildering, hasn't it? Persistent uncertainties tore at Lucia's thoughts as she sat at the kitchen table. Worryingly, the funds vanished. At the very moment, though, her greatest concern was for Ricardo's health, as he was showing no signs of improvement. She retrieved the drug brochure and reviewed it more thoroughly. The nurse in her understood that she couldn't just open her phone's browser and disregard the red flags that something wasn't right. Lucia composed She was expecting to see a list of uses that related to MS therapy when she searched for the medicine's name on the package insert, but she was shocked to see entirely different results. The drug had nothing to do with her husband's cardiac condition. As Lucia's aunt began to process the situation, a sense of bewilderment and suspicion began to take root inside her. As the weight of the discovery settled on her, she mumbled to herself, deciding she needed to end this misunderstanding with Ricardo, but she was a little anxious about the answers she would discover the following day, before the sun had even risen. Lucia woke up with a new sense of purpose, ready to tackle another day of work. However, before she could do so, she had to confront Ricardo about the inconsistencies he had discovered. He approached Lucia while he pretended to be getting ready for another day of forced rest, perusing the prospectuses of the meds you've been taking, and I'm concerned about something. These aren't often prescribed for MS treatment. Could you perhaps clarify this for me? With a keen eye on her response, she inquired. Because Ricardo was taken aback by Lucia's forthright query at this early hour, he hesitated for a moment before answering. My health plan's doctor, huh? These drugs are prescribed by him. Your searches are obviously flawed. I believe we should put our faith in him, as he contacted me and claimed they were the greatest option for my situation. Even though Ricardo said what anybody would expect, his voice remained calm and he avoided looking Lucia in the eyes in favor of staring straight ahead. Something told Lucia there was more going on behind them. Feeling temporarily defeated, she let out a sigh. With the intention of resolving the issue at a later date, possibly when new proof or information is available. Lucia was on her way to work when she said, "All right, we'll see about it later." She wasn't really convinced, but she needed to get going. Reflecting, Ricardo thought. As he sat at the kitchen table, contemplating his impending exposure, he made mental notes to be more cautious in the future. Perhaps a phony doctor's signature would bolster his case. Subsequent to looking for well-known doctors in the area, he ended up drawing lines on paper to try to replicate a professional signature he saw online. Later that day, he was determined to have another free afternoon while Lucia worked. When Ricardo got dressed and headed out the door, he was so engrossed in his own thoughts that he failed to see Marisol, his neighbor, who happened to be gazing out her own window when he passed by. Marisol was entirely baffled by Ricardo's appearance, even though she was aware of his frail state. She was taken aback by his effortless gait, which caused her mouth to open in shock. "But what's going on?" she whispered to herself. Her gaze narrowed as if that could alter the truth, or so she thought. The picture of Ricardo, seated on the couch and reliant on Lucia's care, he stood in stark contrast to the free-spirited figure. Lucia was engrossed in her work at the hospital, but her thoughts were elsewhere. In the midst of her various tasks, she couldn't shake the conversation. Discussion of Ricardo's medicine regimen at our morning meeting. It seems like the drug has nothing to do with treating Ricardo's disease, no matter how much I look into it. Either this doctor is completely mistaken or my husband is being dishonest with me. The betrayal and confusion caused by these discoveries over the break made Lucia feel heavy with uncertainty and doubt. Dr. Navarro, a lawyer, Lucia's long-term colleague and reliable friend, met with her. Navarro, who was always good at listening, paid close attention as Lucia recounted her findings. Regarding Lucia, if this medicine has nothing to do with Ricardo's sickness, then something is amiss. It seems like someone is being dishonest or his doctor is completely mistaken, as you mentioned. Navarro did not find the concept that Ricardo could be lying as ludicrous as Lucia, he added, his face contorted with worry. There has to be an error somewhere. Ricardo is not going to do that. Perhaps the doctor lacks proper knowledge. I'm going to do my best to learn his background. Her reluctance to embrace the notion was evident in her response. The fact that her spouse may be participating in such a complex act amidst hours of contemplation Marisol confronted the situation head-on, telling herself, I can't sit on my hands. I need to do something. With a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in quite some time, Ricardo returned to the house in the afternoon. He retrieved his crutches from outside and made his way towards the door, dodging any suspicion that Marisol, standing defiantly on her porch, was waiting for him. Marisol, taken aback by Ricardo's sight, attempted to keep her composure. Ricardo spotted Marisol walking as if nothing was wrong, and Marisol challenged him about it. Marisol inquired, Can I help you with something? In a voice that mixed caution with fake innocence. Seeking any indication of remorse, her gaze remained locked on his. The realization that his act was under jeopardy made Ricardo's face stiffen. Marisol, you seem perplexed. He spoke rapidly, his thoughts already planning an escape route, upon realizing Marisol was not persuaded. I can hardly move, he said. He became more menacing in his delivery. It would be best if you didn't tell anyone about what you witnessed, Marisol. Getting entangled in things that don't affect you is never a good idea. There is a risk involved. A little frightened, Marisol retreated by the implied danger, but her resolve remained unshaken. She whispered, I just want to understand, more to herself than to Ricardo, who went past her and inside her house, leaving her to face her worries and uncertainties once more. When Ricardo saw the hesitancy in Marisol's gaze, he realized he had to take charge of the situation immediately before it escalated. He approached with a measured serenity, his countenance becoming more stern as he stubbornness to maintain his pretense. Marisol, you believe you caught a glimpse, but I can't promise you otherwise. I beg to differ with you. The light, the shadow, or your vision could be the culprit. His attempt to cast doubt on her perception was based on his assertion that people her age frequently experience such misunderstandings. Marisol maintained a stubborn expression despite her disbelief. Ricardo persisted, his voice now bearing an intimidating tone. Imagine also that you were to inform him of something. Dear Lucia, do you think my ill spouse, who stays up all night, or my neighbor, who has a sudden case of the creeps, will believe me? Allowing the words to sink in, he stopped. Marisol has a clear mind. When people hear accusations like these, they may start to doubt your sanity. It would be unfortunate if others began to believe you were losing your mind. Surely so. Marisol forcefully gulped. The harsh truth of Ricardo's statements sliced through her like a knife. The prospect of danger caused her self-assurance to crumble. She whispered to herself, attempting to rationalize her intervention, I simply desire what is best for Lucia. It was at that moment that Lucia arrived. There was an atmosphere of tension about Ricardo and Marisol when he arrived. Lucia looked from one to the other, asking what was happening as she started to feel queasy in her stomach. Ricardo promptly came up with an explanation. Oh, Lucia, all we were doing was bickering over recipes. In addition to getting used to using crutches, Marisol was offering me dietary advice that may aid with my problem. However, I discovered that I still despise them, he stated while smiling. Pushed, giving Marisol a serious look, as if to warn her of the repercussions of standing up to him. After a little pause, Marisol nodded, her voice quivering under Ricardo's intense stare. That was it. Absolutely. I merely wished to lend ale. She nodded, looking away from Lucia, opted not to push the issue any further, attributing the peculiar vibe to Marisol's worry for Ricardo's well-being. Following a brief exchange of small conversation, during which Ricardo put on an act of civility with Marisol, on her way back to her house, she waved goodbye, her mind racing like a wind-swept leaf, ready to let go of the stress. How do I inform Lucia of the truth without her having any doubts about me? When my credibility is at stake, how can I ensure my friend's safety? Even while she meant well, she couldn't help but question if the truth would really be that difficult to disclose. Despite her failure, Marisol understood she needed a plan when she entered the mansion. With redoubled resolve in the face of hardship, Marisol vowed to herself, I will find a way. The struggle to aid Lucia had only just started, and she needed either tangible evidence or a method to force Ricardo to come clean without allowing him to use excuses and lies. Down until the very end, she was prepared to depart. With a look of contemplation and concern at Marisol's potential vulnerability, Ricardo reclined back on the sofa, displaying significant trouble. He was haunted by the thought of telling Lucia what he had seen. In addition to losing Lucia's support and sympathy, he would also suffer social and maybe legal repercussions if word got out about his hoax. I have to make sure Marisol doesn't say a word. In addition to his immediate worry about Marisol, he calculated each future step with the accuracy of a chess player as he thought. Thinking back on his long-term strategy, Ricardo realized that his original intention was to achieve a life of ease without. He planned to care for himself and provide for the family by persuading Lucia into doing so, despite her duties at work and in her everyday life. As soon as Lucia entered the living room, Ricardo's focus moved from plotting to carrying out. The role she played, a more serious-looking Lucia, approached him and asked him a direct inquiry. She requested a little too much. Ricardo, could you please show me the prescription for these new meds and tell me more about your doctor? Mistrust tinging his speech without hesitation, Ricardo retrieved one of the forgeries from the coffee table, where he had left it for Lucia to discover. The recipe bore a signature that Ricardo had painstakingly forged, a technique he had perfected over the course of several practice runs. This is love. This is the doctor the health plan had recommended. It would appear that he is highly skilled. Ricardo hands Lucia the medication. Lucia asked, "What is his name?" as she thoughtfully perused the paperwork. "Maybe we can pay him a visit the next time we're in town." Nervous but composed, Ricardo waited for Ricardo to respond in the hopes that it would allay his mounting concerns. His response was, he is quite busy and has so many commitments that he prefers not to have unnecessary visits. However, he offered to invite him to speak to you next time if that was something you were interested in. For fear of having his deceit exposed, Ricardo is avoiding meeting with anyone or committing to a name. Not being entirely happy with the response, Lucia chose to pursue that lead later on her own in the apartment. In the fourth place, he dialed the number that Ricardo had given him, his pulse racing with fear of what was to come. Someone finally answered the phone after multiple rings. "Good evening. This is Dr. Mendez's office. How may I be of service to you today?" "1," someone said. "Technically speaking, female greetings. I need to consult with Dr. Mendez regarding a suffering individual. My husband, Ricardo menaces, is battling a terrible illness, and Lucia is doing her best to keep him on his medication." Relaxed tone. "Oh my, we do not currently have any patients with that name on file, ma'am. I apologize for the inconvenience. Would you like to be sure you're contacting the correct doctor?" The secretary's response was bewildered. The secretary's remarks crushed Lucia's heart. She experienced the validation of her emotions as she hung up the phone. Apprehensions were solidifying. Why would Ricardo go to such extreme measures to conceal his lies? A stark contrast to the simmering tensions inside the house was the serene and beautiful Saturday morning. Both Ricardo and Lucia Marisol rang the doorbell of her neighbor's house without hesitation, holding a cake and a plan in her thoughts. It was time to take action, she had determined. I would do it even if it meant facing Ricardo head-on. When Ricardo, who now uses crutches to augment his handicapped performance, opened the door to find Marisol there at such an early hour, he was both astonished and visibly concerned. Under his breath, he demanded of Marisol, "If you came to talk nonsense to my wife, you better leave." Fretting about an insincere act of politeness, when Marisol saw that Ricardo was unhappy, she couldn't help but crack a smile. "Oh, Ricardo, I was only thinking that this cake I baked would brighten your Saturday. I thought we might share it as neighbors." But her voice was full of irony, and her eyes betrayed her sincere want to make you happy. Lucia made her appearance right then. Upon seeing Marisol, her face brightened. "Seeing you here is just delightful. Feel free to enter. Join me for breakfast, please. Surprises are so much fun." "Lucia!" she shouted. Ricardo, who was overjoyed by the surprise visitor, grudgingly stepped aside to let Marisol in, who was accompanied by crutches. At the kitchen table, they sat as Lucia poured coffee and Marisol cut the cake she had brought. A warm ambience was created by the combination of cake and coffee aromas, which created a contrast to the tension in the air as Marisol started to weave comments that, to someone as perceptive as Lucia, appeared to hold more weight than normal. Looking at their characteristics is usually beneficial, Lucia. People aren't that way, you know. Looking thoughtfully at Ricardo, who swallowed his obvious uneasiness, Marisol continued, "Sometimes the truth is sweeter than any cake I can make." Something was amiss. After Lucia excused herself, she stood up and went to the restroom. Instead of going to the restroom, she hid in the kitchen and listened to the talk. At that moment, she overheard Ricardo mutter something along the lines of, "You should be more careful with Marisol. Do not go where you are not invited, Marisol. It would be unfortunate if something occurred as a result of your suggestions." She kept her look neutral and pretended not to hear anything when Lucia came back. The three of them shifted the subject for a time before continuing. And that's when Marisol, she rose to her feet and decided to depart. As they made their way to the door, Lucia waved farewell to Ricardo and told him to wait for her inside the house. Marisol broke down in tears at last, and Lucia, concerned, wanted to know what was going on. Marisol spilled the beans with an unsteady breath. Marisol informed Lucia about everything from Ricardo's odd conduct to threats, and Marisol herself said that Ricardo is not sick and has never been. Lucia listened in horror and disbelief as Marisol described Ricardo as cheating on her. Lucia started to make sense of her uncertainties as they started to make sense, even though they were painful. Sadness and tears, and Lucia was grateful for Marisol's bravery in disclosing the sad truth, but she couldn't help but feel betrayed as she embraced Marisol. In the living room, Lucia faced Ricardo, sensing the obvious tension between them following Marisol's unexpected announcement. She wanted some space and time to absorb the information and determine what to do next. "The guy named Ricardo," she stammered out. "I need to go out to resolve some things at work," her voice unsteady from the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. Ricardo experienced a sudden increase in concern upon realizing that Lucia might be beginning to suspect something more grave. "Now is the time for you to go out. Fixing something at home is not an option. I don't trust her to be out alone at night, yet she seems to be out all the time recently." "My voice," he said. Lucia, who was already overwhelmed by the day's emotions and the growing suspicions in her mind, reacted with an unusual level of determination, saying, "Yes, Ricardo, I'm going out and it's not something that can wait," while feeling frustrated and a bit desperate. His judgment regarding Clara was crucial and did not allow for any debate. "I needed an outside opinion from someone I could trust completely. I picked up the phone and called Dr. Navarro. Can we meet? I need to talk to you about something personal." Ricardo reluctantly agreed, but his mind was already racing with the potential consequences of Lucia's unexpected independence. As Lucia led, Ricardo's mind was in a state of turmoil. Shortly after his response, Lucia and Navarro met in a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. The complete tale was related by her there, beginning with the contradictions in the prescription drugs to Ricardo's oblique threats and Marisol's confession. His expression was carefully noted by Navarro. "Become increasingly grave, Lucia. This is a major issue. Ricardo is acting as if this is a great betrayal and an affront to your professionalism and generosity." In his response, he expressed genuine worry and revolt fury as Lucia continued to investigate. Ricardo, haunted by uncertainty, paced aimlessly around the house. He considered fleeing, escaping the predicament he had brought upon himself, but something inside him prevented him. There was resistance from him. Somehow, this has to be remedied. A strategy started to take shape in his head as he quietly murmured to himself, "Something has to change for her to trust me again. Something major, though, must be considered before any hasty choices are made." Ricardo took a seat. Attempting to steady her breathing and arrange her ideas, he took a deep breath, resolved not to flee, but to confront the situation directly, believing in his capacity to manipulate and regain Lucia's trust, as her mind raced to devise a strategy that would both maintain her present position and strengthen her hold on Lucia's affections. In his last-ditch effort to win back Lucia's faith, Ricardo, determined to keep his deceitful world intact, bolted for the room's closet. After a long search, he located the metal box that had concealed the prescriptions he ought to have taken for years. With a heavy sigh, he had deftly concealed a collection of lies from Lucia, pills still in their original containers, sealed and unopened. With the intention of taking a new one, Ricardo grabbed the bottles. Zero in on her complex scheme of lies. As Lucia returned from her conversation with Navarro, she discovered Ricardo lying on the couch, seemingly following his recovery routine. He was accompanied by crutches, and she watched closely as he took his medications. Lucia made sure not to miss the moment when Ricardo, unknowingly, took more pills than needed. Lucia scolded Ricardo, her voice betraying her concern, for he knew better than to take too much medication. She watched his every move. Lucia doubted Ricardo's knowledge of the potential effects of the drugs and questioned his every action. Nodding his head and offering a subtle smile, Ricardo appeared more desperate than calculated, but it was all in an effort to reassure. "My love, you know how hard it is to rely on others all the time," he added, attempting to elicit sympathy. "I just want to get better faster." Lucia, on the other hand, spent the remainder of the evening quietly watching him without speaking to him directly. After a few minutes, Lucia lay in bed with Ricardo by her side, but she still couldn't sleep because her mind raced with thoughts, particularly those of Dr. Navarro from earlier in the night. "We need concrete evidence." Lucia, something that can only be understood as a falsehood on Ricardo's part without strong evidence. Lucia realized that Ricardo could easily turn the tables on her if she confronted him. Once again assured favor the necessity to expose the truth behind the lies that accompanied Lucia's married life strengthened her resolve, so she devised a plan. On a Monday, she would pretend to go to work, but in reality, she would discreetly observe Ricardo's daily activities while he pretended to be alone. If he is lying about his whereabouts, Lucia would discover the truth. Lucia stood in the neighborhood as the first rays of morning light started to filter through. As she got ready to leave for work, she zipped her suitcase through the front door and cautiously shut it behind her. But instead of going to the car, she took a quick detour to the side of the house, where she could see the back door clearly from her hiding spot. Ricardo emerged from the rear door, warily glanced around, and then started walking with an agility that belied his years, after what felt like hours to Lucia, who was concerned about being spotted. Alleged handicap as he shakily walked away, Lucia, horrified and wounded by the certainty of the deceit, whipped out her cell phone and started taking pictures of him. Lucia cautiously trailed behind Ricardo, not wanting to be caught. They went to a neighborhood tavern, a plain and unassuming spot, where she watched as he entered with an air of familiarity, his crutches visibly absent. Using the opportunity to her advantage, Lucia snapped as many pictures as she could, each one revealing a little more of the brutal reality with her current adversary. "Even though he made sure I had ample proof, my spouse has been dishonest with me for years." Tears started streaming down Lucia's face as she walked away from the scene, overwhelmed by her thoughts and the betrayal she had just confirmed. Eventually, she came to the realization that she couldn't go back home. With her heart like that, it's not the right time. Therefore, Lucia returned home. The neighbor answered the door to Marisol as soon as she rang the bell, and he could see the pain radiating from her face. Marisol asked Lucia, who was terrified, what had happened. Tears streaming down her face, she displayed the images on her phone, unable to utter a word. Marisol embraced her and took her inside the house, telling her, "You are not alone in this." Marisol reassured Lucia and helped her gather her belongings as she placed her on the sofa and offered her comfort, saying, "We're going to solve this together." Marisol spent the hours that followed calming Lucia and gathering tissues. Courage to confront adversity. Meanwhile, Ricardo went back to his house before dark, unaware that anything had been found, believing that his day of freedom had been overlooked. Breathing deeply, Lucia waited a little longer before departing Marisol's house and making her way back home. With every stride approaching the house, her resolve to put an end to the falsehoods permanently became stronger, and she readied herself for the showdown she knew was coming. Lucia silently observed Ricardo in her heart as she returned home and reached the living room. Ricardo, burdened by the disclosures and the photos he had taken earlier, witnessed him open the pharmaceutical container once more and, with an almost reckless disregard for caution, consumed dosages significantly higher than what any doctor would recommend. "I believed I was fortifying my wall of falsehoods with each consumption. Taking extra medication will make it easier to prove the seriousness of my sickness. I figured no one can doubt a guy who is so dedicated to becoming well." He thought he was giving his made-up story more credibility by doing this. On the other hand, Lucia was aware that the reality was different and that Ricardo's behavior simply made the hole he dug for himself with the phone even deeper. While on the phone in a nearby corner, she quietly composed a message to be delivered to Dr. Navarro. Results were in for Navarro. Over the phone, she murmured, "I'm sending you everything now." She then attached the videos and photographs that featured Ricardo. Dr. Navarro, who was on the other end of the phone, answered with the gravity that the situation required, walking normally and often visiting the bar. "Great job, Lucia. I will promptly provide any relevant documents to the court." An ordinary divorce case has transformed into this. He falsified papers, including medical prescriptions and signatures. Passing oneself off as an invalid is a major scam that may get you in trouble with the law. Ricardo, who had previously described the situation in a firm voice, had already laid out a clear course of action when Lucia discovered, before she could answer, that he appeared to be completely absorbed in his own universe at that point. Her single word was being carefully listened to by him. When he realized what was going on, his face contorted into an angry expression. He got to his feet suddenly. Furious and desperate, he started yelling at her. "Why are you treating me this way?" To our benefit, fear gripped Lucia as Ricardo got near, his grip on her arm increasing tighter. With a surge of bravery, Lucia wrenched her arm away and dashed for the door, grabbing hold of the. Along with the house keys, she emerged and discovered Marisol. I could see she was scared because of her expression, and I could also hear the screaming. Luciana sensed that something was off. "I have already given them a call." Lucia waited for the police to arrive inside the house while Marisol indicated in her tone that she was prepared to assist with anything that was needed. Ricardo's screams could still be heard as the two ladies forcefully closed the door. Marisol's heart was racing wildly. However, now that Marisol is with him and the authorities are approaching, the cycle of deceit and manipulation seemed to be finally coming to an end for Lucia. With a firm grip on the keys, she made the decision to shut the door behind her, symbolizing her readiness to leave behind not just Ricardo, but also the sad memories that resided within the house. Anger and despair had taken over Ricardo, and he distortedly stared at the pharmaceutical bottles on the table, thinking he could fix everything. One by one, he started swallowing the pills. "I'll let everyone see. I truly require these medications. You will perceive that I was being truthful," he whispered as his eyesight started to haze. Even though she was outside, Lucia could make out the muted sound of activity inside the house. Marisol, who was by her side, was attempting to soothe her anxiety. "Law enforcement officials are en route." Marisol attempted to console Lucia by saying that everything will be okay. The police showed there soon after and, with Lucia's assistance, they were able to open the door. Their discovery revealed a disorganized situation. On the floor, Ricardo lay unconscious. Beside him lay empty pharmaceutical bottles. As soon as one of the officers took his vital signs, he yelled out, "We need an ambulance here. He's overdosed," and his partner started administering first aid. The doctors at the hospital hurried Ricardo to the emergency room. In order to stabilize him, they moved swiftly. Following a battery of critical assessments initiated as soon as Ricardo's awareness was restored, it was determined that the excessive drug consumption, as a severe adverse impact, it had rendered his legs completely deaf for an eternity. Once Dr. Navarro heard all the physicians had to say, he thought, "It's ironic that I'm facing paralysis after not pretending to be sick for so long." He was already in the hospital and had heard everything. Genuine, though transient, while clutching a large envelope containing documents and images, Navarro calmly said to the newly arrived police officer, "Here is all the proof that Ricardo used phony prescriptions to mask his illness for a long time. False testimony and photos of him walking normally." When Ricardo heard this, he attempted to protest in a weak and shaking voice, saying that he didn't want to hurt anyone and that he just wanted things to be easier. However, the police officer, who was holding him in a preventative detention, responded with caution, telling him that the accusation was serious and that he would have to answer for his actions in court. After leaving the hospital, Ricardo was escorted straight to the detention center. He was unable to raise his head to face anyone. Lucia, I have already spoken with the judge, and she is cognizant of the gravity of the situation. Dr. Navarro contacted her with encouraging news about the individuals he had misled in the hospital during Ricardo's medical care. Navarro expressed a blend of professionalism and support as he stated that the matter is being reviewed swiftly. Still processing what had happened, Lucia simply nodded, appreciative to have someone as capable as this by her side. Trustworthy thanks to you and Marisol's doctor, I was finally able to see a truth that had eluded me for years. The 2 weeks flew by, and when the day of Ricardo's trial came, the courtroom was electric with anticipation and stress. Because he could not afford to retain a specialist lawyer, Ricardo sat next to his makeshift advocate, who was obviously disheartened and still bearing the scars of his recent illness. Lucia sat with Marisol and Dr. Navarro by her side. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, everyone was patiently awaiting the beginning of the hearing. As the judge walked in, the air grew increasingly still. The trial against Ricardo Meneses for fraud is about to start. The judge announced the charges, her voice firm. He is accused of fraud against his wife Lucia Meneses and of falsifying medical records. As the room resounded, Dr. Navarro introduced Claridad and presented the proof, which included photographs of Ricardo outside the house and medical files from the hospital showing him to have taken drugs excessively, as well as his. In a severe glance at Ricardo, Navarro stated, "Consequences. These documents show not only that Mr. Meneses lied about his health, but also the drastic steps he used to keep up his act." Marisol also gave her testimony, detailing the events she witnessed and how, upon becoming suspicious of Ricardo, he threatened her. Marisol stated with a trembling but resolute voice, "The truth is, I just wanted to help my friend, but when I confronted Ricardo, he threatened me." Lucia paused to collect herself before speaking when her moment finally came. "I had faith in him throughout it all. I adored him." The words he spoke were deceitful and filled with anguish. He lied about his health and used that falsehood to manipulate everyone around him. Ricardo got a chance to explain himself, but his remarks came out as hollow and desperate. "I was terrified of losing everything, and I didn't want to be a burden, but I ended up becoming just that." Despite Ricardo's lawyer's best efforts, Lucia remained unconvinced despite his attempts to elicit sympathy from her. The court carefully considered both parties' arguments on the evidence's credibility, took a short break, and then came back with a ruling. Mr. Meneses is obviously at fault. She struck the gavel to end the proceedings, telling him that he would be found guilty of fraud and that he would have to face the repercussions of his conduct, which include losing his claim to the joint property and serving 5 years in prison. As she departed from the court, Lucia experienced a blend of relief and melancholy. Justice had been served. Regardless of the price, Marisol remained by her side. Putting a reassuring arm around her, he spoke to her. "Lucia," Marisol whispered, "you can begin again now." They departed from the courtroom prepared to embark on a fresh chapter. Both Lucia Maris and Ricardo's life had taken drastically divergent turns months following the trial. While serving his time in a state prison, Ricardo became completely immobile as a result of the adverse consequences of the medications he consumed without control. He passed his time confined to a wheelchair. As I survey the desolate yard, feeling bad about the decisions that got him into that tough situation, with a regretful voice, he said to himself that he should have taken a different route. Still, his mobility improved gradually, and he was soon walking again. However, the news of his condition was shocking. Lucia and Marisol discovered solace in one another, despite the fact that Temporal learned an important lesson about being truthful and loyal to everyone around him during his time in prison. The power of truth and resilience was reflected upon by Marisol and the two as they sat in a local coffee shop on a sunny afternoon, sharing a cup of coffee and talking about the events that had changed their lives. "It's strange to think about everything that happened, isn't it? How can life change so drastically?" Marisol asked, her voice filled with awe. Lucia made a comment while fiddling with her coffee cup in an absent-minded manner. Marisol grinned, peering over her friend's shoulder in astonishment. "I found the power of a genuine connection throughout all this turmoil, and that is truly valuable to me." Dr. Navarro quickly joined Carino and herself as they were conversing, providing details on the case's legal completion and verifying that Ricardo was good to be cared for appropriately and held responsible for what you do. Navarro said farewell and left them alone again at the end of the afternoon, saying, "See how you two support each other. If you need anything, you know you can count on me." As the sun dipped below the horizon with a gentle grin forming on her lips, Lucia gazed out the cafeteria window, thinking, "Despite everything, I think we are on a better path now, Marisol." She went on to say, "There is always a light even after the darkest nights." With Lucia's hand on the table, Marisola felt a sense of security and assurance that they could overcome any challenge that life threw their way. They drank their coffees, prepared to face whatever the future held. You have reached the conclusion of another thrilling story, knowing that the bedrock that would support them through any difficulty was truth and friendship. Please consider subscribing to our channel and giving us a thumbs up. We are driven to keep going by these kinds of acts. Day-to-day storytelling also, keep an eye out for the video that will soon play. Looking forward to seeing you in the upcoming video.